There's a specific kind of person who walks into a room and, without saying a single word, changes the entire emotional temperature of the space, not because they're trying to, not because they're performing or seeking attention or doing anything deliberate at all. Something about their mere presence disrupts the usual social rhythm, makes people laugh at moments they didn't expect to laugh, makes liars suddenly stumble over their own words, makes rooms that were tense just seconds earlier inexplicably settle into calm. If you've ever been told you have a strange effect on people, that you seem to see through them before they've said anything revealing, that your humor cuts uncomfortably close to truths nobody else was willing to name, that you seem to attract chaos and clarity in equal, bewildering measure, you might be something far rarer than a typical empath. You might be what's known, in a term borrowed loosely from Lakota spiritual tradition, as a Heyoka empath, sometimes called the sacred clown archetype, the mirror soul, the contrarian healer whose entire way of moving through the world seems designed to reflect truth back at people, whether they're ready for it or not. Today we're walking through 7 signs that you might be one of these rare, deeply misunderstood empaths. And by the end, you're going to understand why your entire life may have felt so different from other sensitive, empathic people. Even other empaths who share your emotional depth but none of your strange, disruptive gift. Let's start with the first sign, because it's often the most confusing one to live with, especially before you have language for what's actually happening. Sign 1. You make people uncomfortable by simply being calm. Most empaths absorb tension. They walk into a chaotic room and feel the chaos settle into their own body, taking on the anxiety of everyone around them like a sponge with no filter. A Heyoka empath does something different, something almost paradoxical. Instead of absorbing the room's energy, she seems to reflect it back, amplified, until the people generating that chaos are suddenly forced to confront it themselves. This is often deeply unsettling to people who are used to their tension being absorbed rather than mirrored. Someone who's used to manipulating a room through subtle intimidation, controlled outbursts, or performed distress suddenly finds those tactics don't land the way they're supposed to. Instead of anxiety, they encounter calm. Instead of a reaction to manage, they encounter stillness that somehow makes their own behavior feel more exposed, more visible, more absurd than it did a moment before. This isn't something a Heyoka empath does on purpose, at least not at first. It's simply how her nervous system seems wired. To reflect rather than absorb, to mirror rather than mimic. And the people most destabilized by this quality are almost always the ones most invested in controlling a room's emotional atmosphere for their own benefit. Sign 2. Your humor makes people laugh right before it makes them uncomfortable. There's a particular kind of joke a Heyoka empath tells, one that lands as funny in the first half second, and then a beat later reveals itself as something closer to an uncomfortable truth nobody else in the room was willing to say out loud. This isn't cruelty. It's not even really intentional confrontation. It's simply an instinct for finding exactly the thing everyone's avoiding and turning it, almost involuntarily, into something that can be laughed at rather than something that has to stay buried. This gift makes Heyoka empaths incredible at diffusing tension in healthy relationships, where honesty is welcome even when it stings a little. But it makes them deeply unsettling to manipulative people who depend on certain truths staying unspoken in order to maintain control. A well-timed joke that accidentally exposes someone's manipulation tactic, spoken with genuine warmth rather than malice, can dismantle years of careful narrative control in a single sentence, and the manipulator rarely knows how to respond to something that disarms them through laughter rather than confrontation. Sign 3. You attract chaos but somehow become the person who resolves it. This is one of the strangest patterns Heyoka empaths report about their own lives. An almost uncanny tendency to end up in the middle of dramatic situations, family conflicts, group tensions, not because they caused them, but because something about their presence seems to draw the underlying dysfunction to the surface. And once it surfaces, they're often the one who ends up resolving it, sometimes without even trying, simply by refusing to participate in the usual patterns of avoidance everyone else has silently agreed to maintain. This isn't random bad luck, and it isn't something a Heyoka empath consciously seeks out. It's the natural consequence of being someone whose presence disrupts avoidance itself. Dysfunction that's been quietly tolerated for years suddenly becomes impossible to ignore the moment she's in the room, not because she points at it directly, but because her own honesty and lack of pretense makes everyone else's performance more visible by comparison. Sign 4. You feel other people's emotions, but express your own unpredictably. Most empaths are known for emotional consistency, steady compassion, reliable warmth, a kind of predictable gentleness people come to depend on. A Heyoka empath's emotional expression is different, often surprising even to herself. She might feel someone's grief with overwhelming, tearful intensity, and minutes later find herself laughing at something entirely unrelated, not because the grief wasn't real, but because her emotional processing doesn't follow the linear, expected patterns most people are used to witnessing. This unpredictability, so often misunderstood by people expecting conventional empathic behavior, is actually a sign of an unusually honest relationship with her own inner world, one that refuses to perform emotions in the orderly, socially acceptable sequence most people learn to display, choosing instead genuine expression over predictable performance, even when that genuineness confuses the people around her. Sign 5. You can't be lied to comfortably, even when you desperately want to believe the lie. This is one of the most exhausting parts of being a Heyoka empath, and one of the least understood, because it doesn't feel like a gift in the moment it's happening. It feels like a curse, because while most people can be persuaded, at least temporarily, to accept a comforting lie over an uncomfortable truth, a Heyoka empath's perception simply won't let her fully settle into the deception, no matter how badly she might want the relief of believing it. This means that even in relationships where she desperately wants to trust someone, a partner who's cheating, a friend who's been dishonest, a family member spinning a story that doesn't quite add up, some part of her registers the inconsistency almost immediately, even while another part of her, the part that wants connection, wants peace, wants to avoid the exhausting confrontation that comes with calling it out, tries desperately to override that perception and simply accept the comfortable version of events instead. This creates a unique kind of internal torment most other empaths don't experience in quite the same way. She's not just absorbing someone else's emotional pain, she's simultaneously perceiving truths she often doesn't want to perceive, caught in a constant tension between what she senses and what she wishes were true instead. This is precisely why Heyoka empaths often describe feeling like they can never fully relax into a relationship the way other people seem to, because some part of their perception is always working, always scanning, always registering the gap between performance and authenticity, whether they want that awareness active or not. This is also why narcissists find Heyoka empaths uniquely difficult to manipulate long-term, even when they succeed in doing so temporarily. Because eventually, no matter how skilled the deception, no matter how badly she wants to believe the comfortable version of events, her perception simply won't allow the lie to sit undisturbed forever. Something always eventually surfaces, some inconsistency she can no longer explain away, some moment where the gap between what's being performed and what's actually true becomes too large to keep ignoring. Sign 6. You've been called too much and not enough by the same people, often in the same conversation. This particular contradiction confuses almost everyone who hasn't yet understood what a Heyoka empath actually is, including, often, the Heyoka empath herself. She's told she's too intense, too blunt, too unpredictable, and in the very same breath, accused of being emotionally unavailable, too guarded, not open enough about what she's really feeling. She's criticized for seeing too much, understanding too deeply, calling out patterns nobody else has the courage to name, while simultaneously being told she doesn't share enough of her inner world, that she keeps people at arm's length, that she's somehow both overwhelming and inaccessible at once. This contradiction isn't actually a contradiction at all once you understand what's really happening. A Heyoka empath has learned, often through painful experience, that her full authenticity is genuinely too much for most environments to handle safely. So she calibrates, constantly, moment to moment, deciding how much of her actual perception, her actual insight, her actual emotional honesty is safe to reveal in any given interaction. This calibration, invisible to the people around her, produces exactly this confusing pattern. Moments of overwhelming intensity when something finally breaks through her filter, followed by periods of guardedness where she's protecting people and herself from the full weight of what she actually perceives. Sign 7. You've spent your whole life feeling like you're playing a different game than everyone else. This final sign is less about a specific behavior and more about a persistent, lifelong feeling. The sense that everyone else seems to be operating according to social rules she never quite received the instruction manual for. Rules about which truths stay comfortably unspoken, which performances are simply expected and shouldn't be questioned, which forms of denial are considered polite rather than dishonest. A Heyoka empath often spends years, sometimes decades, feeling like an outsider observing a game everyone else seems to understand intuitively, wondering why her instinct toward radical honesty, her inability to perform social fictions convincingly, her tendency to name things everyone else has silently agreed not to mention, makes her seem strange, difficult, even threatening to people who have built entire relationships, families, and communities around comfortable, unspoken agreements. This isolation is often one of the most painful parts of being this kind of empath, because it doesn't just separate her from people who might exploit or misunderstand her. It sometimes separates her from other empaths too, people who share her depth of feeling, but not her disruptive relationship with truth, her instinct toward mirroring rather than absorbing, her inability to simply accept comfortable dishonesty the way even other emotionally sensitive people often learn to do in order to maintain social harmony. If these 7 signs feel less like a checklist and more like a description of a life you've been quietly living, confused and sometimes ashamed of qualities that never seemed to fit anywhere else, understand that what you're carrying isn't a flaw to fix or a social deficiency to overcome. It's a specific, rare kind of gift, one that comes with real cost, real isolation, real exhaustion from a lifetime of being misunderstood by people who needed you to perform comfortable fictions you were simply never built to perform. And understanding exactly why this gift exists, what it's actually for, and how to finally stop apologizing for it. That's where we're headed next, because here's what almost nobody explains to a Heyoka empath early enough in life to spare her years of unnecessary shame. This disruptive, mirror-like quality isn't a malfunction of an otherwise normal empathic gift. It's a different kind of gift entirely, one that serves a completely different function in the world than the more commonly understood empathic archetype most people are familiar with. A traditional empath, the kind most self-help content focuses on, primarily absorbs. She takes in the emotional atmosphere around her, processes it, and often works to soothe or repair whatever disharmony she senses. This is a beautiful, necessary function, and the world genuinely needs people capable of that kind of emotional absorption and repair. But a Heyoka empath serves a different, equally necessary purpose. She disrupts. She reflects. She makes visible what's been comfortably invisible, not to cause harm, but because certain kinds of healing simply cannot happen until the truth being avoided finally gets named. And this disruptive function, uncomfortable as it can be to live inside, is precisely why Heyoka empaths so often find themselves at the center of major turning points in other people's lives. The friend whose blunt honesty finally prompts someone to leave a relationship they'd been quietly suffering inside for years. The family member whose refusal to participate in comfortable denial finally forces a long overdue conversation the entire family had been avoiding for a decade. This is uncomfortable, exhausting work, and it rarely comes with immediate gratitude. People don't typically thank the person who disrupted their comfortable denial in the moment it happens. Often, quite the opposite occurs. She gets blamed for the discomfort itself, accused of causing problems that were actually there all along, simply unacknowledged until her presence made them impossible to ignore any longer. This is one of the loneliest aspects of being this kind of empath, and it's exactly why so many Heyoka empaths spend years believing something is fundamentally wrong with them, rather than understanding that they're serving a function most environments simply aren't equipped to appreciate in the moment it's happening. But here's what becomes possible once a Heyoka empath finally understands what she actually is. Rather than continuing to measure herself against an empathic archetype that was never quite her true nature to begin with, she stops apologizing for the intensity that used to feel like a character flaw. She stops trying to soften her perception in order to make other people comfortable with lies she was never actually capable of believing anyway. She stops mistaking her disruptive gift for social failure and starts understanding it instead as a specific, valuable form of service, one that draws exactly the right people into her life, people capable of appreciating radical honesty rather than being threatened by it, while naturally repelling the people who depended on her silence, her softening, her willingness to perform comfortable fictions she was never actually built to perform. This is where real peace finally becomes available to a Heyoka empath. Not through changing who she fundamentally is, not through learning to absorb and soothe the way traditional empaths do, but through fully inhabiting the specific, unusual gift she actually possesses, trusting that its disruptive quality serves a purpose the world genuinely needs, even when the people directly experiencing that disruption in any given moment fail to appreciate it. Because here's the deeper truth underneath everything we've discussed today: every relationship, every family system, every community that depends on comfortable unspoken lies to maintain its fragile equilibrium eventually needs someone willing to name what everyone else has silently agreed not to see. This role has existed across nearly every culture throughout human history. The sacred fool, the mirror, the one whose refusal to perform social fiction becomes, paradoxically, one of the most healing forces available to people trapped inside patterns they don't know how to escape on their own. If you've spent your life feeling too intense, too blunt, too unpredictable, too disruptive to fit comfortably into spaces built on polite denial, understand that this was never actually a flaw needing correction. It was simply evidence that you were never meant to serve the same function as everyone else around you. You were built for something different, something rarer, something the world, despite how uncomfortable it often makes people in the moment, genuinely cannot function without. You are not too much. You are simply calibrated for truth in a world that has spent generations getting remarkably comfortable with the alternative. And once you finally stop apologizing for that, once you finally understand that your discomfort-inducing honesty was never a social defect, but a specific, ancient kind of medicine, you'll stop measuring yourself against empaths whose gift was always meant to look different from yours. You'll simply become exactly who you were always meant to be. The mirror nobody can lie to. The clown who makes truth impossible to ignore. The Heyoka.